109.9 seconds into an early episode about artificial intelligence, the narrator says the words, "Chat-GPT wrote me a plan," out loud. Except, it doesn't say Chat-GPT, it says shat-GPT. Clean as day, time-stamped. And it ships anyway. Nobody catches it until someone reads the log 3 days later. That's the archive I'm about to hand you. The internal record of a video pipeline that's supposed to run itself, start to finish, with nobody watching. And its earliest documented moment on tape is the system mispronouncing the name of the thing it's covering. If that's the opening line of the story, whatever comes after is being held together with hope. So here's the actual question I want to answer. Is this thing genuinely running itself? Or is Autonomous doing a lot of PR work for something that's really just chaos wearing a nice cream paper title card? Because those two answers point in opposite directions. If it's the second one, every other automation claim this channel makes, leadership automation, workflow automation, all of it, is suspect by extension. You'd be right not to trust any of it. But if it's the first one, there's a real, evidenced answer sitting in 9 weeks of this system's own receipts. Every fix dated, every failure priced, every reversal written down the day it happened. I've read that whole archive. I want to walk you through what it actually says. I pulled up the engineering log, a running journal the pipeline keeps of everything that broke and how it got fixed, and found the entry for episode 1, take 11. Take 11. 10 prior attempts had already failed by the time this one crashed at frame 6,224 mid-render, for reasons nobody had fully diagnosed yet. And that wasn't even the expensive part. Before episode 1 existed as a real episode, the team burned about $30 just proving the concept could work at all. 11 separate prototype renders, none of them a finished video, all of them build. Take 3 alone stalled silently for 3 hours with nothing happening, and nobody sure why. A mid-render safety audit on the same episode burned $23.44 of its $100 budget on 14 separate escalations before anyone even got to see a frame. Read that cold. It sounds like exactly what the cold open implied. A system falling apart in slow motion, running up a bill while it does it. Here's what surprised me though. Every single one of those entries, the crash, the stall, the $23.44, is dated. It's diagnosed. It names the exact line of code and the exact dollar figure. This isn't a system quietly falling apart and hoping nobody notices. It's filing paperwork on its own failures like it expected this to happen and wanted proof for later. A thing that's actually falling apart doesn't stop mid-collapse to write an incident report with a timestamp on it. There's more of that same pattern a few weeks later, during a full rebuild of episode 2, and this one's my favorite entry in the whole archive because of how it ends. The rebuild needed 16 separate relaunches in a single session. 16. And the note the team left themselves afterward doesn't read like an apology, it reads like a lab result. Every one of those 16 failures happened in the free part of the system, the bookkeeping and coordination layer that decides what's done and what isn't. $0 of paid generation were burned. 0 video was corrupted. The expensive stuff, the AI images, the AI voice, the AI video, held up fine through all 16 crashes. Only the free scaffolding around it kept falling over. That's the kind of failure you can actually afford to have 16 times in one afternoon. And it's worth sitting with the money for a second. That first $30 prototype phase eventually became a real per-episode bill of about $66 once the system was doing full episodes, then got cut nearly in half, down to about $34 once the team went back and repriced everything they'd been paying for. The waste wasn't hidden. It was tracked closely enough to shrink on purpose. But here's what doesn't fit that reading at all. A journal that documents its own worst moments isn't evidence of chaos. It's the opposite of what duct-taped together actually looks like. Something barely holding on doesn't pause after every stumble to write down exactly what happened and what it cost. But once you keep reading, the archive stops looking like a system falling apart and starts looking like a system running a deliberate, nightly hunt for the best deal it can find, while everybody who built it is asleep. Every night at 3 a.m., a piece of code called the Model Scout checks the public rankings for image and video generators, comparing quality against price, looking for anything that beats what the pipeline is already using and costs less to run. It's not a person doing this. It's a scheduled job, unattended, running the same discipline every single night, whether or not anyone remembers it exists. And the provider choice underneath it wasn't an accident either. The team runs on a platform called Fall instead of Google's, for one specific written down reason. Google's content filters are stricter, and they were rejecting legitimate creative work the show needed to make. That's not a system flailing. That's a system with opinions. On the record. I want to show you what almost went wrong with that scout though, because it's the best evidence I found for how seriously this thing takes its own homework. Early on, the price comparison code had a bug. It was comparing one model's price per word against a rival model's price per second. Two completely different units, like comparing a gas station's price per gallon to a car dealership's price per mile and acting surprised when the math comes out weird. That bug made a model look about 10 times cheaper than it actually was. If nobody had caught it, the pipeline would have quietly started routing paid work to the pricier option every single night, convinced it was saving money the whole time. Somebody normalized every price down to one shared unit, dollars per second of actual output, before the scout was ever trusted to make a real decision again. That instinct, measure the actual thing, not the thing that looks true, shows up again in a completely different corner of the archive. Audience retention. Every early episode with enough viewers to measure lost somewhere between 35 and 45% of its audience in the first 30 seconds. Not one episode, every one they could measure. And when the team dug into which opening lines held viewers and which ones didn't, they found the worst offender was the channel's own signature move, the exact opening template this whole format had been built around from day one. A vivid, specific opening held 84% of viewers at the 15-second mark. The abstract templated one held 56. That's 28 percentage points walked away because of one repeated sentence structure nobody had questioned. So they deleted it, not softened it, removed it entirely, and built a rule into the system that won't let a script ship with that opening again. The word final doesn't mean much in this archive either, and the clearest proof is the narrator's own voice, the one reading this sentence to you right now. It went through 9 separate design rounds before the team wrote, in the decision log, in plain capital letters, final. 2 days later, they ran one side-by-side test against a newer version and replaced it anyway. A month after that, they auditioned 7 more alternatives just to check their own work. Total spend about 30 cents, and the incumbent won again, fair and square. One of the also-rans got permanently blacklisted for a much funnier reason. It's the single most used stock voice on AI YouTube right now. And nobody wants to sound like every other channel using the same free voice out of the same drop-down menu. So final in this archive doesn't mean permanent. It means true until somebody measures it against something better and writes down what changed. 10 formal reversals in 9 weeks, all told. And every one of them is dated, which is the opposite of embarrassing. Defending a decision because you already made it, once, in public, is the actually expensive habit. And it's the one this system was specifically built not to have. Here's what this actually costs you if you get that wrong. A render that lies to you. One that reports success and hands you an empty video file where a finished one should be. Doesn't just waste an evening. It burns your trust in the automation itself. And once that trust is gone, you're not running an autonomous system anymore. You're babysitting one, forever. Because you no longer believe it when it tells you the job is done. Which means the real test of autonomous was never whether this pipeline could avoid failing. Nothing running unattended for 9 straight weeks avoids failing, not once. The real test is whether it can tell you, immediately and honestly, the moment it does. And the clearest proof of that sits in one specific episode that failed 5 times in a row and still shipped on time. That episode is episode 18. During one recovery attempt, it failed, then failed again, then 3 more times after that. 5 straight failures, and every single one turned out to be the exact same ghost. A piece of stale internal bookkeeping that survived every attempt to delete it, because deleting it piece by piece let the surviving pieces quietly regenerate the ones that were gone. Nobody was fixing a video problem, they were fixing a haunting. So the team taught the system's watchdog process to recognize its own ghosts, to freeze the haunted attempt as evidence, the way you'd bag something for a case file, carry forward only the verified work into a clean folder, and resume from there automatically. What used to be an 11-hour stall with a human awake babysitting it became one automatic step. Episode 18 shipped a finished 14-minute 38-second video about 2 hours after that fix went live. That's the actual answer to the question from the top. Yes, this is autonomous. Not because it stopped braking, because braking got cheap and loud and self-correcting. The same lesson shows up somewhere much smaller and, honestly, more embarrassing. The render engine itself, the piece of code that actually assembles the finished video, used to leak memory during long renders. 3 separate times on 3 separate attempts, a 52-minute render died at frame 15,493 out of 16,096. 96% finished. 3 times. Nobody could see the leak from the outside. The system just quietly ran out of resources 1 frame short of the finish line, over and over, like a marathon runner collapsing at mile 25.9 on 3 separate race days. The fix wasn't a guess. Somebody measured the actual leak rate, roughly 0.8 of a file handle per frame, and hand-patched the underlying rendering library line by line until the number went to 0. The lesson repeats everywhere in this archive, in bigger and smaller forms. Never trust a report that says the job succeeded. Open the file. Check that the thing you asked for is actually there. You've probably done a version of this yourself. Trusted the green checkmark instead of actually opening the document. This system got burned enough times that it now assumes the checkmark is lying until proven otherwise. This system turns that same honesty on itself too, not just on individual episodes. When the team built a central control panel, one dashboard meant to hold every dial and setting for the whole show, somebody eventually went back and audited it properly and found that editing 37 of its 94 settings did absolutely nothing. Whole sections of the dashboard were connected to nothing at all. You could drag a slider all day and the system underneath would never notice. 3 of those dead settings were even labeled live, actively lying to whoever touched them. Every fake dial got ripped out, 94 settings down to 57 real ones, and a standing rule got written afterward. From now on, a setting nothing reads automatically fails a test before it ships. That rule then partially reversed itself in the most on-the-nose way possible. This morning, 3 length limits got deliberately rebuilt as real, working dials. Specifically so this episode, the one currently playing in front of you, could run past its old 10-minute ceiling. You are, right now, listening to a fix that exists because the archive needed to talk about itself for longer than the rules used to allow. None of this runs on the video pipeline alone either. And that's the part people miss when they picture autonomous as one clever piece of code humming away by itself. Underneath the show, there's a search system that can instantly find the right sentence out of 5,251 of the team's own internal documents. There's a knowledge graph, a structured map of facts and dates with 2,501 separate nodes built specifically so the system can answer a question like, what was actually true on this exact date, instead of guessing from memory. There's a hardened piece of connective code, built only after an earlier version slammed a rate-limited service so hard it failed 4 times in a row and saved 0 results. None of that exists because it's impressive. It exists because a system that's supposed to run for weeks without your attention needs somewhere to keep its memory, and something that pages a human when things actually go wrong. Code that runs unattended isn't the same thing as a system nobody has to think about. So here's what I actually want you to notice, watching all of this from the outside. The mispronunciation in the cold open, the 11 takes, the $23.44 burned mid-render before a single real episode existed. None of that was the system failing to be autonomous. That was the system becoming autonomous. One dated, priced, diagnosed entry at a time, in a file nobody outside the team was ever meant to read. And if you're the one trying to decide whether to trust something you built to run without you overnight, a pipeline, a process, a whole team you're not standing over, I'd stop grading it on whether it's stopped failing. Nothing that runs long enough stays unbroken. That's not the useful question, and chasing it will just make you anxious and slow. The useful question is whether it writes down what happened and what it cost the moment it happens before anyone gets around to fixing it. Here's the one thing worth doing differently starting today. The next time something breaks on your watch, write down what happened and what it cost before you touch the fix. That file is the whole difference between a scar and a guardrail. One just hurts, the other one remembers for you. The log entry where shat-GPT wrote me a plan misfired as shat-GPT wrote me a plan at 109.9 seconds is still sitting in that archive right now, exactly as it happened. Unedited, timestamp, and all. Nobody went back to quietly delete the embarrassing part. And the newest entry in that same file, written this morning, is the one that lifted a length limit, so this exact episode could run long enough to tell you about all of it. Its worst moment, and its latest one, sitting in the same file, in the same unbothered tone. That's not a system holding itself together with hope. Not luck either, and not PR. That's just what the design actually looks like, once you stop expecting it to be clean. That's the memo. Read.